but
Scottish
also
one.
because it sort of illustrates, I suspect, a lot of what we're going to be discussing in terms of branding. Does everyone know what this is who isn't Scottish?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so
This
I'm
and there
kind
is.
of quite quickly. This is excellent. So one of the things, so when you buy something, whether it's a fizzy drink or a chocolate bar, one of the things that you might be looking for, I'm guessing, is how would you know how to spot this? I'm guessing because of the colours. Maybe? Well, the colour of the thing itself, right? Possibly part of the branding, particularly like the orange and the blue together.
Yes.
So we're immediately seeing here that when you go to buy it, you presumably assume that it's going to taste the same every time you buy it. We're just ignoring sort of, any other reasons why it might be different. So you know that you know what you're going to get when you buy it, when it has this branding. Now, the reason I particularly want to use this as an example is that actually it's a good example of different forms of intellectual property working at the same time. So very clearly, we're going to have a trademark. Without knowing anything about trademarks, what do you think the trademark here is?
Irn-Bru, right?
Yeah,
Irn-Bru.
Irn-Bru, yeah,
The
as
logo.
the text. If there's a logo, or if they're looking at sort of the wording as
Colors.
the logo, it might be. The colours are going to be a bit more difficult.
Okay.
So colour potentially is a sign and trademark, but it's difficult to demonstrate that it is actually a sign. What about the actual product itself? Is there any other intellectual property right? I realise that you've done all 3 days of intellectual property so far.
I guess the formula.
Yeah. Yep, the formula. And this is actually, so on the point of the formula, seemingly, Irn-Bru as sort of the formula is quite famous because they managed to keep it a trade secret, which is a little bit unusual. Well, Coca-Cola is perhaps the other famous example.
Yeah.
But you use trade secret to protect the product, you use trademarks and potentially then passing off in relation to the packaging to protect the way that you sell it. Now, in terms of the branding, whether you think it's effective, well, that might be a question for people who are sort of most familiar with it. Did you discuss this in your group? Or was it just that I sort of spotted it and thought this would be an excellent example? Thank you very much.
An example.
Yeah. So, as an example, so with the ones that you've picked, in a similar way, have you been able to identify something that works around the branding? And having done that, my next question would be, can you identify any intellectual property rights that attach to it? Now, we don't need to go as far as sort of trade secrets or perhaps design rights or something, but maybe we could have sort of 1 or 2 examples just to sort of get us thinking about it. Why do you buy it? Is the branding effective? And is there some kind of IP that's associated with it?
Okay. Which
Anyone?
one would you like?
I mean,
Cool.
there was someone who was talking about, I think, about the colour brown in relation to, was that someone at the back? So this was quite, can you say a bit more about that? And I don't know what the product was, but it sounded sort of interesting. Was it cereal? Or?
No, about beauty products and how if we have more natural colors that we think the product itself is becoming more natural based in ingredients and how you associate different things with color or brand.
Yeah, so this is an excellent example. So the idea that you're going to try to make sure that the packaging or the advertisement or sort of all the different branding that's associated sort of tells you something about the product. Now, the reason that's important, similar probably with other examples, is that the branding is a form of communication. All of this is communication. Trademarks, in particular, which we're about to discuss, are one particular way of protecting the way you communicate. So in relation to, say, sort of eco-conscious branding for makeup, you would have the packaging, say, is sort of brown, or it doesn't sort of have fluorescent colors. Intellectual property law allows you to protect that packaging, so you can continue to sell it so people know what you're trying to communicate, which is that this is in some sense sort of environmentally friendly or natural or otherwise. So this is an excellent example. Any other examples from your sort of day-to-day life? One more? Anyone?
Useless level.
Anyone?
Say it, yeah. Okay.
We actually talked
Yeah.
a
Okay.
bit about other stuff.
Right.
We were not talking about exactly what the product has like for trademark.
Oh no, it doesn't have to be for the trademark. So something, say, that you repurchase on a regular basis.
Like we
How effective is its branding?
we
basically?
talked about
We
Nes-
spoke about the product
okay.
in terms of the way
After
they
him.
really advertise.
Yep.
Yeah, so like some things like, for example, we were talking about Snickers, and recently Snickers has come in as like when you know you do when you're hungry. So now when you're actually hungry, you do actually think of a Snickers sometimes. Whereas normally the last thing you would think of to eat when you're hungry is a chocolate bar. Like it's,
Now it's actually I think of it when I'm aggressive because
yeah, you don't have to when you're hungry. So Snickers has put it that way. So sometimes now you just walking by and you feel a bit hungry. You're like, you know what? I can just grab a Snickers and that would solve my problem, even though it's not me.
Yeah, okay, so this is the other part of it, right? So when we talk about brands as communicating, some of it will be through color, other will actually be through text. So we're looking at both image and text when we talk about branding. But more than that, the thing that you touch upon, which I think is very important and something that we're going to discuss next week, is that when we think about what brands do and how we create them, it's not actually a one-way street. So the thing that we understand both about brands and by the subset of marks that are registered is that they tend to be co-created with the consumers. So the brand works because the consumer is in some sense interacting with them. So the brand is never actually created just by the producer, which is why actually the meaning of a particular brand can change depending on how consumers use it. So I think this is actually very important. You're saying, well, you don't necessarily intend to enter into this dialogue with the Snickers advertisement, but the whole effectiveness of it is that actually you do. And so what we're looking at in this term is, well, how can you actually propertize elements of that branding? And the main way you can propertize them is through a trademark registration. Or later on we talk about passing off through goodwill. So I think these are sort of some of the issues to think about as you're doing your reading, I think, for next week. To think about sort of the brand as something bigger, the trademark as something that's not necessarily overlapping with the brand, but a way that you might actually choose to protect it. And so I want to just raise a few of the themes that you might want to think about again in advance of the next seminar. One is that brands exist within a market. I mean, this is obviously sort of quite obvious, right? You're competing with other brands. It sort of exists within a marketplace. It has a certain economic value. That's the first one. The second point, sort of following on from sort of this communication with the consumer through color, through text, is that there are sort of particular psychological elements to it. It's trying to interact with actual people. But the flip side of that is sort of a sub-point is that also the consumers are creating the brand. So there's a dialogue. The third point, so we go from sort of the marketplace to the individual, the third point is that there's very clearly a sort of social and cultural context to branding. And that is to say, perhaps in its most basic sense, is that brands or particular signs will transcend the marketplace and potentially attain a cultural value that becomes sort of decoupled from the product to which they're affixed or the product with which they're associated. So I mentioned the Olympics, excellent example. The Olympics has extraordinary protection, not only in trademarks, it has specific intellectual property rights that protect those symbols. At the same time, it is clearly a very significant cultural and sporting event that people would like to use for their own purposes, or that they'd like to interact with. Similarly, you might have particular signs that are politically problematic. So for instance, you might have examples of signs that have, well, not value, but the opposite of value. So for instance, you register a sign on the trademarks register, you attempt to register a sign that's racist, for instance. It's not going to happen because they have a social, well, ideally it's not going to happen, but there's like a social value that's also attached to the mark. So the things that you might choose to then protect is also telling you something about political communication. So what we're looking at in terms of branding, the thing to bear in mind is that we're looking at it at a number of levels. And the law, in relation to trademarks, in relation to passing off, unfair competition, designs, copyright, trade secrets, to the extent that we discuss them, is actually interacting with brands potentially at a number of different levels. So we're looking at the market, we're looking at the individual, and we're looking at sort of the social or the political elements. And you know, trademarks isn't always necessarily best placed to sort of mediate between sort of the competing demands, but I think it's something that's quite important to keep in mind when you evaluate. What does this rule do? So for instance, if we protect the Olympic rings, what is the effect of that? Is this appropriate for the individual brand owner? Sure, it's amazing. Is it appropriate to an individual? Well, maybe an individual doesn't really care. Does it matter to, say, a small producer who wants to cash in on, say, the Olympics being in Tokyo, but they won't be allowed to? You know, then it might matter. Does it matter to someone who wants to parody the Olympic symbol? You suddenly think, well, trademark law might prevent you from parodying the Olympic symbol, but maybe you could argue that it's so important that it should be able to transcend the legal protection that's given to it, as an example. So these are sort of some of the things to sort of think about. There will undoubtedly be others, but in terms of the context, bear in mind that that's always sort of going to be somewhere in our assessment of the rules. Did someone have their hand up?
Yeah,
Yes.
I just don't know if we have enough time. I had a question.
Yes, we do.
Okay. The thing is, I wanted to ask if you might know why, for example, Primark's name in Ireland is Pennies. And we recognize like Primark because of its appearance, of the writing, of the brand, and also the color, the blue color.
Mm-hmm.
But still, isn't it dangerous to change the name? First, I thought it's Primark in Germany as well. I thought because Pennies is also already a grocery market. So I thought maybe they don't want to compete with that name, but it's Primark over here as well, so I was not really sure about that.
It's probably for business reasons. So first of all, IP rights are territorial, so it's completely not unusual that you would have sort of different ways of doing it. It might also be a question of company law, the way sort of different subsidiaries are organized. Probably it's specific to that market, and I agree that they're not wanting to compete perhaps with something that's similar, so they're trying to distinguish themselves. Having said that, of course, in relation to trademarks, lots of different producers can have the same name as long as they're not in the same class of goods. So presumably, Primark, I'm assuming, doesn't sell sort of sandwiches or groceries or something, right? So you could have a Primark that sells cereal and groceries, and you would have a Primark that sells clothing, and they could both exist in the UK market. Unless, just skipping ahead 4 weeks, Primark is considered to be so famous that it should have some kind of special protection. So I suspect that they've probably done some kind of consumer research where they thought that actually this would be appropriate. I mean, I don't know, but this would be my guess. And yep.
Another question actually. We have a restaurant in Germany which is called Best Wurst. That like Wurst is it actually means Wurst, like sausage, but it's not written as sausage.
Yep.
So because if it would have been written as sausage, they couldn't have put the name Best Sausage because that would implicate that this sausage is the best one you can get, and that's something you can't prove.
No.
Is it the same?
No, the problem would actually be worse than that. So I don't know about in terms of whether you get it, but the problem would be worse. The problem would be that you might get into the trouble of not being sufficiently distinctive, that no one would trademark it anyway.
Okay.
So that might be why they changed their name. I don't know whether you might get in trouble for sort of false advertising. I don't know, but potentially problematic. But this is, so think about this, again, all of these choices will be deliberate. Sometimes they will go horribly wrong, and we'll look at some of the examples where this sort of thing has gone horribly wrong. But, you know, these are all issues around both the images and the texts that will come up. What are they trying to do and why? And will trademark law allow them to do it? I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
I basically wanted to ask, so in terms of an advertising strategy that brands use, for example, like stickers right now, can that be associated or added to their trademark? For example, if they did it for 10 years straight,
Yeah.
would it just be like only Snickers can come and be like, we're the chocolate that eradicates hunger? Or, for example, Kit Kat couldn't come in tomorrow and be like, you're hungry, have a Kit Kat.
Yeah,
Would
so,
that become part of the trademark in a way?
so, not in terms of trademark, but yes, potentially in terms of passing off. So if I can just be Australian for a moment, there's a case called Pub Squash, which talks about advertising. and we can discuss this at length. If you want to send me an email, I will make sure to put it on the reading list. We can talk
No,
about it.
don't.
But yeah, so there are ways of sort of attempting to protect sort of advertising techniques, but it's going to be much more difficult. As we'll start to see in a couple of weeks' time, you're usually identifying the thing to which the right attaches, but that will almost never encompass the entirety of the branding strategy. So often, so to give an example from perhaps next semester, and one that's quite a good one because it keeps changing. So Rihanna, the singer, has a beauty line, which you'll be aware of, right? So she has a name that she uses for singing. She has a beauty line called Fenty. Yes? It has a logo. She also has an agreement with a number of other brands, for example, Puma. So you may have seen, actually I'm not sure when this campaign would have been, but there's a photograph of her, there's the name Rihanna, there's the Puma logo, right? So here we have two brands together. The actual advertising campaign, you might be able to protect a photograph in copyright. Puma will be a registered trademark. Rihanna will be a registered trademark in that particular font. Fenty separately will be a trademark. Possibly together, maybe they would double register it, but I'm not sure because I haven't searched. But equally, Rihanna herself might be able to protect her image, like as a brand individually. So, yes, you could potentially have protection for the campaign, but you'd actually have to disaggregate the different rights. And the way that you would protect it would probably be through passing off. In German, it would be through the personality right, and then the different logos and things through trademarks. So that's a very long way of saying that. That's a very good question, and it's going to take us sort of a semester probably to answer it. Okay.
Back to you in December.
Yeah, so we will know all of this by December. Right, thank you very much for your input. If you wouldn't mind